Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Matt Rajansky. I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Today's event is another in our series related to the Kennan Institute's Solzhenitsyn initiative. The initiative was established in 2014 to translate into English for the first time Solzhenitsyn's memoir of his years in exile in the West, entitled Between Two Millstones, and has since received additional support to enable us to translate untranslated portions of the Red Wheel saga. You can find more information about the initiative on our website. Today's book and all books in the collection have been published with the University of Notre Dame, and we thank them very much for that partnership. Indeed, the audience listening today can save 30% on March 1917 Book 3 by using the code 14FF30 on the University of Notre Dame's press website. Before I give the floor to our speakers today, I also want to announce a new development in our Solzhenitsyn initiative. At the suggestion of Stephan and his brothers, and through a generous private donation, we have been working for the past few months on an interactive map application as a reader's companion to the Red Wheel saga. With this app, the readers can find important buildings mentioned in the books, can see their location, both in historical period maps and in modern maps, and read related descriptive text about each of them. The reader can toggle between English and Russian language versions, and there's a slider bar that enables the viewer to switch between old and new views of the city. Stephan, the Kennan Institute, and I personally thank you for the creative vision to bring this project to us, and we very much look forward to launching it in full very shortly. A final piece of housekeeping: as you're listening at any point, including right now, if you have a question, you can submit it by email to Kennan, K-E-N-N-A-N, at wilsoncenter.org. You can tweet it at Kennan Institute, or you can post it to our Facebook page. Please include your name and affiliation when you're doing that, so I know who's asking the question. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. And I think what I will do is just introduce each person, then have them speak, and then introduce the next speaker, since I think we're still working on some connection issues. But we'll begin with Marian Schwartz. She has translated Russian classics such as Anna Karenina and Oblomov, and contemporary fiction and nonfiction, including such authors as Mikhail Shishkin, Olga Slavnikova, and Leonid Yusufovich. She's the recipient of numerous honors, including 2 NEA translation fellowships, the 2014 Read Russia Prize for Contemporary Literature, and the 2018 Linda Gaborio Award for Translation, awarded by the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, and is also past president of the American Literary Translators Association. Her latest published translations are, of course, Solzhenitsyn's March 1917, The Red Wheel, Node 3, Book 3, the book we'll be discussing today from University of Notre Dame Press, and Nina Berberova's first novel, The Last and the First, from Pushkin Press. Marian, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Kennan Institute for hosting us and the University of Notre Dame Press for its commitment to this project, this long-term commitment, and to the Solzhenitsyn family, but especially Stephan, with whom I've been working, we don't even know how many years on this project, but for entrusting so much of his father's work to me. It's been exhilarating, but in a way humbling to be involved in this project. Solzhenitsyn's work has had, probably like many people of my age, had an outsized influence on me when I was first learning Russian. I started learning Russian in 1969. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, The First Circle, Cancer Ward, and later Gulag Archipelago were probably to blame for my lifelong passion for Russian literature. A few other books came into the picture, but they've certainly been books that have hovered at the back of my consciousness for the last 50 years. So as I said, being involved in March 1917 has really been an exhilarating experience, for which I thank everyone for letting me be involved. I have translated a lot of nonfiction in my career, but primarily I translate fiction and really view all texts through a literary prism. I am completely convinced that part of the reason, or a big reason, for the success of these books is not just because of the facts and the depth of them and the comprehensiveness of them, but the way Solzhenitsyn chose to tell the story. And I use the word story quite intentionally. What's been interesting is over the last few years, as the books have come out, it's not just scholars who are reading this book. At least I know people who have read these books, and they're perhaps people who are certainly interested in history in general, but they bug me. Like, when is the next volume coming out? As if it were some kind of serial or something that they had to find out what was going to happen next. And I think it's these literary qualities that lift the narration out of just a dry recitation of fact. He puts us so squarely in a time and place, and we get a visceral sense of what it was like to be in those days. Some of those areas that I find interesting in this regard are his use of dramatic tension, his pacing, his change of registers, or just collection of registers. For example, with dramatic tension, book 2 ends with Nikolai's experience, not his abdication, just his abdication, but his experience of the abdication. And it's an abdication that Solzhenitsyn has just wrung out of him. And sometimes it feels like he's wrung it out of us. Like, when on earth is he actually going to abdicate? And that's how book 2 ends. But book 3 begins with the abdication too, not with Nikolai, but with other segments of the country and the society that are affected by the abdication. And once again, we're right in the middle of this confusion and misinformation and poor communication. And, as clear as Solzhenitsyn makes it that the abdication had to happen, it becomes really inevitable in his telling. It's not as though the abdication brought any clarity to Russia. That's sort of the last thing it did. So that's an example of the kind of tension he maintains in the book. Book 3 maintains the same kind of alternation of chapters, the same kind of pacing, relatively short chapters, alternating plot threads and sets of characters. And with that alternation of chapters, I would say reminds me tremendously of Tolstoy. Well, there's a lot about Solzhenitsyn that reminds me of Tolstoy, but this type of organization of the material with a really almost, it's an almost reassuring alternation. He's going to, he's going to leave these characters, but he's going to come back to them, and he's going to pick up this line of questioning and this line of inquiry. So in that way, that's one of the ways that he reminds me of Tolstoy. So with these different, one thing that keeps up the reader's interest is that the register changes as we go through these chapters. So we have the hyper-formal speech of the imperial family, we have the political lingo of the politicians, the more common lower class language of soldiers and workers, and even those chapters of newspaper clippings, which I think are very effective. And they actually remind me tremendously of Bulgakov's White Guard, where he has these cinematic scenes of snatches of things that are incomplete in themselves, but create an atmosphere and a mood, and bring in many different threads at once. I don't think the intention was necessarily the same, but the effect is very similar. So one of the translating Nikolai was in some ways the easiest part because it's the most correct, but there's also a tone to be achieved. And I came across this one passage that I just adore it. It's Solzhenitsyn describing Nikolai's thoughts after the abdication. And he says, this is Nikolai talking to himself. Might he not have abdicated? Simply said no, and that's that. Dug his heels in. And what? What would they have done? And there's so much going on here. First of all, this really hyper-formal mother may I, might he not have abdicated? I mean, who says that to themselves? Might he not have abdicated? He's in the third person. He's acting, almost asking permission. And then he answers, no, I'm going to say no. I'm going to dig in my heels. It sounds like a little boy. He has nothing more substantive to say. He's laughably ineffectual, but it's the best he can come up with. He doesn't have anything. He has no other resources. So it's just a wonderful passage for showing you more about Nikolai. Solzhenitsyn, again, like Tolstoy, doesn't ever tell you directly that someone is good or bad. In Anna Karenina, it's never done. The only times, I mean, I've done a word search on this. The only times he calls anything good, Tolstoy does. We can do this now. It used to be an impression, but now I can actually back it up. When Tolstoy ever says something is good or bad, it's not because they're morally good or bad. It's because they don't feel well or something like that, or food has gone bad, but it's never about a person. He obviously has his opinions about who's good and bad, and you know it perfectly well. And Solzhenitsyn does the same thing. Another person he does this with is Kerensky, who he clearly has more than mixed feelings about, but he never brands Kerensky, but he has, sometimes his descriptions of the physicality of Kerensky are really kind of snarky. I mean, they don't put him in any kind of good light. If he had more respect for Kerensky, he wouldn't have described him that way. So I'm kind of hopping around, but the other point I want to make about what strikes me literarily about this book is the unusual number of women there are. Now, in those first books that I read, the early books, these were not situations where there are going to be a lot of women. And in fact, in books about the revolution, there aren't a whole lot of women either. And he actually, some of them are fictitious. Of course, there's a lot about Alexandra, who it's a fairly damning portrayal of Alexandra, but he gives her a fair amount of space in the book. And every one of those women is very different. They're very individual, and he demonstrates a tremendous amount of respect for their autonomy and their actions as being whatever they are, even if they're stereotyped in various ways, they're still autonomous, and they make decisions in an independent way. In fact, in book 4, this is a spoiler alert for all of you, there's a chapter on Kollontai, Alexander Kollontai, which, boy, I was not ready for that one. I was really not ready for it. It's a very interesting portrait of her, possibly even something to be excerpted. I'm not sure if that can work, but it might possibly be something like that. But it's such a, it's a human understanding of her, not as because she's a woman, but just who she is, and her circumstances as a woman obviously come into play, but he didn't have to do that. It's just tremendously surprising to me, the number of female people who came in. So those are my thoughts on translating this book. Again, I apologize for hopping around, but maybe somebody will want to pick up on something I said. I don't know. Okay.
Thanks so much, Marian. I quite intend to pick up on a couple of things you said, but I'm going to save them for our discussion and introduce Professor Mahoney, who I gather is now with us, both audio and video. I can see, wonderful. So let me just Yeah, we hear you. So let me just introduce Professor Mahoney, who's an emeritus professor at Assumption University and a senior fellow at the Real Clear Foundation and senior writer at Law and Liberty. He's a specialist in French political philosophy, anti-totalitarian thought, especially Solzhenitsyn, in the intersection of religion and politics. He's the author or editor of 12 books, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology, The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order, The Other Solzhenitsyn, Telling the Truth About a Misunderstood Writer and Thinker, and The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. He is executive editor of Perspectives on Political Science and was awarded the Prix Raymond Aron in 1999. And his latest book, The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation, comes from Encounter Books next May. So, Professor Mahoney, the floor is yours.
Well, for a brief moment, I wasn't sure I was going to make it because of some technical difficulties, but we're all set. And I am very grateful to Matthew and the Kennett Institute for sponsoring this event, giving us an opportunity to talk about the Red Wheel and specifically about book 3 of March 17, which is we come in medias res, right in the thick of things during the February or March Revolution, 6 crucial days, to use the Gregorian calendar, between March 16th and March 22nd, 1917. And I should say, a little prop here, I just received a copy of the book from UPS at 1:30 this afternoon. So I'm very, very happy to have that in hand and not simply a galley copy. Let me begin. I mean, Marian's remarks were very important. To begin with, I think she's absolutely right that when people engage the Red Wheel, they find it compelling, both as a historical work, a work of dramatized history. The fictional characters are reduced to something of a minimum as we head our way through the volumes, the books of March 1917, note 3 of the Red Wheel. But even though in profound respects it's a work of dramatized history, it's also a powerful work of literature, as Marian highlighted. And I could mention some chapters. Marian mentioned the Kollontai chapter in book 4, but there are the chapters, for example, on the uprising of the Baltic Fleet and the assassination of the progressive-minded Admiral Adrian Nepenin, or the final chapters of the book, the Tsar, who I think the plans of the provisional government, very powerful, weak, ineffectual government that governed for, as Solzhenitsyn once said, -2 days. But the original plan of the comparative moderates in the provisional government was to allow the Tsar and the Tsarina and the children to go to England at the invitation of Nikolai's cousin George V. But the Soviets get wind of this. The authorities, Prince Lvov's government is essentially powerless. And once the Soviets make clear that the royal family is not allowed to leave Russia, is not to be allowed to leave Russia, and moreover, that they should be placed under arrest, that's exactly what happened. So by the end of the book, the Tsar, who has not resisted the revolutionary movement, was abdicated for himself and for the Tsarevich. He is under arrest with his family, and he is literally produced for inspection. And I should mention that in those 2 dramatic final chapters of March 17, I think they're very, very they're beautifully done. We see this kind of listless Tsar, not sure how to present himself to these commissars from the Revolutionary Soviet. And at one point, after he's on the 2nd floor, he marches across the stairwell in view of his revolutionary inspectors, and he takes a look. He wasn't planning to look at these revolutionary commissars, but he looks at them and he sees the sheer malice, the hate in the eyes. And this really is, I think, a portent of things to come. I think once the royal family had been denied the ability to leave Russia, once even a comparatively moderate, the liberals and socialists from the Duma and civil society who made up this new ineffectual government, once they had given into the Soviets and the Tsar and the royal family were under arrest, I think something like what happens in July 1918 at Ekaterinburg, the murder of the royal family and their staff and their pets and all of that. I mean, in that malice, one sees a portent of things to come. I would just reiterate, I think Marian's absolutely right. Solzhenitsyn is not didactic in the sense of editorializing, but it's very clear that he thinks the liberals and socialists who make up the provisional government have no sense of the necessity for political freedom to be supported by authority and a certain modicum of civilized order. In one scene, we have Prince Lvov musing about whether we even need, let's get rid of the city governors, let's get rid of the governors, let's get rid of the police, the people's militia can take their place. And then he says, thinking about Lev Tolstoy, the older, the religious rebel and heretical prophet Tolstoy, not the author of War and Peace, he thinks, why does a free people need authority of any kind, you know? And Lvov comes across as a fool, a good man, a peaceful man, but somebody who is not meant for this historic moment. Kerensky is worse. Kerensky has something of a Napoleonic complex. He gives the appearance of having authority. You know, he's always moving about and he's hectoring friend and foe alike. And he talks as Minister of Justice. He's the leader of the revolution. But in fact, he's essentially, I think, a windbag. And not somebody, the revolutionary, the Soviets, Soviet of Workers, revolutionary deputies despise him as a bourgeois turncoat, but he himself despises the more moderate liberals. There are a few people who were treated at some length in the book, the war minister Guchkov, the foreign minister, the cadet leader Milyukov. I think they do have a sense of reality, but there is chapter after chapter where Guchkov confesses his powerlessness. He's Minister of War, and even after Admiral Nepenin is assassinated, coldly, cruelly in Helsingfors, this what begins as insubordination and harassment and arrest of officers ends up in a brutal murder that is portrayed in one of those experimental themes of the Red Wheel cinematically. But Guchkov concludes, I have no ability or power to arrest the Admiral's killers. I should add, there's one figure who comes to the forefront in book 3 of March 17. Again, recognizing that Solzhenitsyn doesn't editorialize. It is quite clear that Solzhenitsyn esteems Admiral Kolchak, the future supreme governor of the White Forces, the government at Omsk, who was murdered by Bolshevik forces on the 7th of February, 1920. He esteems Kolchak. Kolchak is much more sober than Nepenin. He doesn't think overthrowing the Tsarist state in the middle of a war is a good idea. He thinks Russia needs stability. He's not a particularly political man, but he needs stability and order and not violence, unrest, and potential civil war. He manages quasi-miraculously to hold the Black Fleet together. At one point, he communicates with the Grand Duke, the head of the Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces, and says, we need a dictatorship. Kolchak had no interest in being a personal dictator, but he thought that Russia needed something like a Roman dictatorship, a restoration of order, so that civilian government in wartime could be restored at the proper moment. Well, Kolchak has a sense of what is being lost, how ineffectual General Headquarters is, how worse than ineffectual the nullities of the provisional government are. But he has no authority per se, but he clearly represents, I think, a way of thinking that stands out in March 17, Book 3. I'll say it stands out for this reason. Kolchak is one of the few figures who not only represents command, authority, hierarchy, not in a reactionary way, but in a way every society, including a liberal society, needs. Not order number one, the order sent out by the Soviets by telegram to all the armed forces that essentially got rid of saluting, got rid of the subordination of ordinary soldiers and sailors to officers, made ordinary soldiers and their little committees, gave them a role in making military decisions, etc. Kolchak recognizes, I think Uchkov also recognizes, that no society can afford to have armed forces where the principle of order, hierarchy, and command is negated. So Kolchak is very interesting. The portrait is extremely sympathetic. I think he's the most sympathetic character to appear in the Red Wheel since Pyotr Stolypin in Node 1, August 1914, the great 8-chapter Stolypin cycle, the flashback to the last real statesman, reformer, but also defender of order, a man who Solzhenitsyn, I think, hoped might have had the ability to keep Russia out of a disastrous war, et cetera, et cetera. So the appearance of Kolchak, I think, is really quite interesting. We have the double comparison with Admiral Nepenin, the comparison with the lack of fortitude, foresight, prescience, energy on the part of the figures, all the figures associated with the provisional government. And then, of course, we have on the other side the forces of disorder. There's a very powerful chapter about Lenin in Zurich, in bourgeois Zurich. He really hated bourgeois Switzerland. You know, he wanted to get back. He wanted to direct. He wanted to intervene. But even Lenin, who had great acumen, Lenin thinks the Tsar is still fighting for control. The provisional government is powerful. Even Lenin can't believe that the revolution has proceeded with such swiftness, with such success, that the forces of quote unquote reaction have been bested so completely, so quickly during these 6 days of March. So, well, and I'll just add a little tidbit. I asked Stephan about this, who confirmed it to be the case, that Solzhenitsyn in his office in the suburbs of Moscow had 2 pictures, Pyotr Stolypin and Admiral Kolchak. So that's revealing. That's not part of the book, but it does reveal that. And also recently looking at the journals of the Red Wheel, 1960 to 1991, which are not out in English, Solzhenitsyn speaks quite explicitly about how he was attracted to Kolchak, how he admired him. So that's no secret. He makes that quite explicit. Last point I'd like to make is Solzhenitsyn, as some of you I think know, first conceived writing the Red Wheel at the age of 18 in 1936. And he even wrote a draft of what would become the description of the Battle of Tannenberg that was indeed used in large part in Node 1 in August 1914. So there's some continuity in this work. But of course, Solzhenitsyn was a young revolutionary, the centerpiece of universal history in 1936 for him. This is before the scales of ideology fell from his eyes in prison and camp. October was the center of universal history. And Solzhenitsyn says in the journals of the Red Wheel that I thought I had no real interest in the decline of the old regime or even the February Revolution. Those seem to be phenomenon of the right, you know. You get rid of those quickly and you go right to Red October. But I think Solzhenitsyn came to see that, and of course, this is not a widely shared view. the widely shared view is these were 8 months of golden democracy. The only time when Russia was free. Solzhenitsyn really believes nothing good happened during those 8 months, that the prospects for ordered liberty, civilized liberty, avoiding totalitarianism were lost because of a revolutionary mindset infused by revolutionary inebriation that dominated the events of March 1917. And I think that's why the 4 volumes of March 17 become the centerpiece of the Red Wheel. Of course, there's a kind of addendum at the end after April that goes through October and through the Civil War. But Solzhenitsyn, I think, very self-consciously had concluded, again, paradoxically, at odds with almost all observers and commentators, academic or otherwise, that the real revolution, the decisive revolution, occurs from March 8th to March 31st, 1917. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Mahoney. Stephan, I think, is with us, and yeah, great, unmuted. So let me introduce Stephan Solzhenitsyn now, last but certainly not least of our speakers for today, and then we'll go into questions. And let me just remind our listeners that as I see some of you already have, please email any questions to Kennan, Kennan at wilsoncenter.org, tweet them at Kennan Institute, or post them on our Facebook page. So Stephan Solzhenitsyn is the executive director of the Alexander Solzhenitsyn Center and CEO of Siberian Coal Energy Company. Born in Moscow, he lived in the West from the moment of Solzhenitsyn's 1974 expulsion until 2004, when he returned to live in Russia. Throughout his life, he's participated in a number of his father's projects and publications, and is a board member of the Russian Social Fund and of the Solzhenitsyn Center. While in the US, he received his education in environmental studies and city planning. He has a master's degree from MIT and a bachelor's degree from Harvard. Stephan's professional work in the US spanned the energy, real estate, and transport sectors. He conducted and managed environmental impact studies and licensing permitting procedures. In Russia, he's focused mainly on electric power, district heating, greenhouse gas emission abatement, and the nuclear, coal, and freight industries. Stephan, without further ado, please.
It's such a great opportunity to speak not about all of these, highly, industrial and somehow, at the end of the day, boring for many people, boring topics, and to dive back into Petrograd, 1917, with Marian and with Dan and with all the people that have joined us here. Thank you, Matthew, also for this opportunity. I'm going to speak very briefly, and I'm going to try to pick up on a few of the points that Marian made and that Dan made to give us maybe it'll end up being a good and interactive point. I'm struck that we should remember that in this volume, in this book 3, the emperor has abdicated, but there's this immense sadness about his personal, about how personally he handled the burden of power. But he's also relieved because, after all, he just abdicated in favor of his brother. His brother's going to pick up power. His brother's going to be emperor. He's going to be Emperor Mikhail. So at the end of the day, look, he thinks he's really done the right thing. He's avoided bloodshed. And later, as I was listening to Marian, I just recalled, a very poignant piece when a true hard thinking staff general, not a war general, but a staff general, where the last name is Svichin, is thinking about how what a horrible military leader Nikolai has been. But to his own surprise, he actually turns around, and I just remembered this piece, and I had to, if I can, I'll just give you this paragraph, because I think it truly captures so much of the I think of the tenor and sadness of the emperor in this particular book. So the general notes that in his abdication, His Majesty had stated that there was no sacrifice he would not make for the true good of the homeland. This, he thinks to himself, was so unbusinesslike, so unmilitary, So incommensurate with the emperor's commanding height, or with the correlation of forces, or with where the sacrifice was needed, it was a cry of pain. I move on a bit. In this sudden cry, his very core poured out, as it was. In this cry, it was impossible to lie. This cry made clear to everyone that their distant, reserved, incomprehensible emperor, in fact, had only one thing in his soul, that he was prepared to sacrifice himself for Russia. Only he didn't know how. And he had done so in the worst possible way. I think I am, as I was listening to Marian, I wanted to find that spot, and I read it back now, and first of all, I have a few feelings. First of all, to Marian, just such great thanks for, rendering Solzhenitsyn's prose, I think, is in some ways pretty simple prose. In reality, it's very different chapter to chapter. I think one of the great things it's been a joy with Marian working on this is the simplicity of his prose. To the degree it is a simple prose, is exactly how it's done. That simplicity comes across, that power comes across. But if I think about the meaning of this further, here's a collection. Really, what is the revolution? Revolution is in many ways something that happens to a country at war. Its actual fate is absolutely delivered and made on the basis of will a more than 10 million strong army, where is Russia? Russia is in many ways its army, which runs from Finland. Finland is a safe zone, but the whole Baltic Sea is a theater of war with Germany. Right down the middle of what is at this point today Belarus. At this point is the front. Right down the middle of what is today Western Ukraine is the front. Romania is the front. The Black Sea Fleet is a front. Turkey, Iraq, what is today Iraq and Iran are fronts where the Russian and from the south British forces are joining. This is a world war, and Russia's 10 million strong army is fighting this war, and all of the generals. And there are many other generals that are talked about and that portrayed in this book. They've got their one topic, which is they need to win the war. And they are all thinking about the revolution as it's an inconvenience that they need to solve, a problem that needs to be solved so they can keep fighting the war and so that they can win the war. And there is absolutely no one. And of course, if the Tsar had stayed when the revolution happened, if he had simply said, "Look, the revolution, there is a way to solve this inconvenience. We isolate Petrograd. We send forces to Petrograd. Blood will be spilt, but that's too bad." That would have been the hard, calculating approach that you might expect somebody who's not willing to sacrifice everything for Russia, or somebody who is cold. Sort of hard-headed would do. Instead, the Tsar, he can't imagine shedding Russian blood. He's fighting a war. Russia's fighting a war. All these generals are saying, "Well, look, I've got battles to win. This is an inconvenience. Let's change. We can just, somebody else can take it. We're pragmatists who need to win." They weren't traitors. And I think Solzhenitsyn does a very good job showing that they weren't traitors, but they were absolutely also not statesmen. Tragic figures like Alexeyev, he's here everywhere. If only the poor old man had still been sick. If only Gurko had still been who was a very different kind of general, had still been in his place as the head of the main military headquarters, the general headquarters. But Alexeyev was a pragmatist, and as soon as he realized that he got rid of the Tsar, but then already he helped the Tsar abdicate, he eased his way out, and immediately in this volume he sees that he's been bamboozled. He's been lied to. There's other generals who actually, appreciate the fact that they actually worry about how they'll look in society in among the revolutionary crowd. There's others who don't, but they're lost. They're not statesmen. And so, so it's also a lot about the limitations of individuals. Have a few different people in place. Solzhenitsyn always thought this, and I think that was actually the great argument between Solzhenitsyn and Tolstoy, is that Tolstoy says, look, forces. First of all, neither of them says this. Both of them, as Marian correctly said, show it. But Tolstoy showed great forces in action. Solzhenitsyn shows little people in action, who by accident of history, it could have gone all very differently. What I think makes, for me, this book compelling and the entire Red Wheel compelling is that you truly get a sense for, none of it had to be exactly this way. It could have potentially been very different. We don't know. The future is not predetermined. And that makes, I think that, yes, that really makes this a riveting read. It actually makes it a riveting read. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephan. You anticipated actually some of my questions there. Wonderful. I want to launch the discussion, but actually I want to begin with an audience question, because I think it's in some ways the most important question to begin with in this project. And that's, can you just explain so that everybody listening understands, why in fact has it taken so long for these works to become available in English?
It's not Marian's fault. She's done. If we'd moved at the speed of Marian, they would all been out. But first of all, a few things. There are pacing. I think pacing is would be is a good thing. It's actually, my own sense is it's good when Notre Dame is actually able to bring a different Solzhenitsyn work. There's so much that I think this whole project, Red Wheel, but also other works that by Solzhenitsyn that are coming out, the memoirs that Notre Dame does. First of all, that spacing I think has worked quite well, even if for those readers that want to get book 4 of March, it means some delay. But I am at fault here too. This isn't, and that is that I do essentially. I'm a bit of a helper and a bit of a things like working on indexes, things like doing some of the standardization and the rest of it. So I actually have also, I am personally responsible for the fact that some of this, the book 4 isn't out yet. And so Marian occasionally very kindly asked me how I'm coming along with what I owe her. and has been very gracious in letting it happen. So your question will certainly lead me to realize that we need to accelerate for the readers that are hankering for it.
Matthew, can I say a bit about this?
Sure, Daniel, go ahead.
Sure. I think it actually, everything Stephan said is true. And I would also say, though, it goes back much further to the 1980s. For example, the augmented edition of August 1914 that included the Stolypin cycle and much new material going back before the Battle of Tannenberg, the original opening. That all appeared in French in, I think, 1984. I believe the augmented edition of August 1914, translated by one of Solzhenitsyn's great translators, as is Marian, I should add, Harry T. Willits. Harry T. Willits, who did the 96 chapter First Circle, the canonical edition of One Day, Oak and the Calf, August 1914. He was a splendid translator. He worked very, very slowly. So that had something to do with the disparity between, let's say, the French pace of publication of the Red Wheel and the Anglo-American one. But I think it also had to do with the fact that a consensus had developed in the 1980s, before the books even came out, that the Red Wheel was a failure, that it was clunky, that it was didactic, that it wasn't a real work of literature, that it was reactionary. Some of that came from the third wave of emigres. Some of it came from Russianists and Sovietists who had prejudices against Solzhenitsyn, but it really was quite amazing. People were making not only political philosophical judgments about the Red Wheel, but aesthetic ones on the basis of books they hadn't really read. And I also think Solzhenitsyn's New York publishers, Harper and Farrar, Straus and Giroux, lost some interest. And some of that I think was political. There are other things at work, but I would say it's a blessing and a godsend in a way, because it would have been very easy in the 80s and early 90s to say this is all yesterday's news. Who cares? You know, with the implosion of European communism, who really cares about 1917? And paradoxically, Solzhenitsyn's focus on March, you know, on the kind of moral anarchy and civic anarchy, it's in a way much more relevant to the present situation, where the Western democracies seem to be suffering from a crisis of self-confidence and a crisis of authority and deep ideological polarization. And in that sense, and also, I think Stephan made a very important point that the Notre Dame Solzhenitsyn series, the works have been paced out very carefully. They give people time to take them in, to ruminate, to reflect, to appreciate the literary and historical and philosophical contributions of these books. And also we have a new generation of translators like Marian who have taken up this task, and I think in a really splendid way. So I think that's just fleshes out the story a little bit for those who are interested.
Marian, do you want to comment on the timing? No? Okay, we have Stephan's answer, which is you did it fast.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, well, let me, actually, Stephan, I'd like to ask you a question. In some sense, and I think you'll remember this, we covered this ground, particularly when we put out Between Two Millstones, but this is about kind of the experience of being around your father as he was writing, you know, what his process looked like, you know, in a sense, you know, where did he write, when, how, with whom? I remember there being sort of a lot of roles that you and your mother played in the process, you, your brothers, I should say, and your mother. Could you say a little bit about the process of your father's writing?
Yeah, for On the Red Wheel in particular, and that was the main thing he was working on all through my childhood. Well, a few things worth noting. First of all, he had a journalistic, in many ways, the eye of a journalist and the pen of a journalist. He wrote out an immense amount of notes, quotes, text, sometimes pictures. He archived them. He basically had in effect, he had a relational database, except not computerized. You know, envelopes that that were by subject matter, by person matter. Sheets that allowed him to when something mattered both to a person and to a theme, you know, it was so cross-referenced, sort of a very he was somebody who planned things very well. He's very structured. The composition, as he called it, and that is to say the chapter structure, was something he had absolutely thought ahead of time. So when Marian says things like, it's reassuring, you know, he'll be back to them, he was not somebody who said, oh, geez, you know, I really need to get back to that character. It was all planned. In that sense, he's somebody you would say is a very highly organized, very structured individual, somebody who I look at, for example, sometimes interviews with him, and I realize, oh my God, you know, this is a person who, you know, he had no pauses, or he had pauses in very few cases. You know, he never bandied about from one place to another. The thought he had, is the thought it came across. The thought that needed development to be shown and to be detailed, he then detailed. Very crisp, I would say, very, very crisp. And what he then did with all this material that I've talked to you about is that he knew what of that material he would need literally tomorrow morning. So let me start in the afternoon. In the afternoon, he organized tomorrow morning's chapter, tomorrow morning's page or two. And this was a process that you would find him at a huge writing table. He loved the space he could have when you're not worried about the knock on the door from law enforcement, checking on what it is you're doing and what it is you're writing, and whether with threats to your personal security at a minimum. That was a true era of freedom, and he truly enjoyed that freedom. So he spread out. The tables, these were mega tables. These were what you would literally imagine as a desktop. Imagine a computer desktop with 1,000 files on 1,000 little clips. Well, he had them. He had them certainly by the dozens, and actually maybe even hundreds, weighed down by paperweights when need be. He was getting ready for the writing. Now, the writing was when flesh appeared on the bones. The bones were there. The mega structure was there ahead of time. The structure of tomorrow's chapter, he literally arranged with papers. These are scraps. The scraps are in his archive. People can later, probably look at those scraps. They'll have archival value for researchers. But putting flesh on the bone, now that happened in the mornings. And so the evenings could be spent reading, reflecting, not writing. But the morning, that was the sacred time of writing. And that was when he truly needed quiet. More than anything, it was quiet. So things like if we wanted to go shoot hoops or anything during a summer morning, hoops were after 1 p.m. because before 1 p.m. it was writing time. It was quiet time. The one thing, as you were asking about what we did, during our childhood, we basically. We would courier. There was also an editing process going on. So my mother's role she was the editor. She basically she typeset. She challenged him. Commented, challenged, said this doesn't work, that doesn't work. She would write these comments. That needed. Now he would sometimes be a few hundred yards away. And if he was writing somewhere a few hundred yards away, they needed a courier service between them, so that the editing process went in parallel with the writing process. And that was the role that I and my brother sometimes played. It was couriering, literally back and forth edits, and sometimes I would even ask what he's working on, and this was sort of golden memories of childhood, basically. Helping indeed make these pages happen. But then, of course, I only grew to appreciate what this work was, obviously, at a much later age when I was, able to read it. I think one of the great joys for me of working on and seeing these books come out, reading Marian's translation, is that I can relive the book again. And what a pleasure to relive it in what is for me my other native language. So yeah, I feel I do, of course, feel that in a very small way, it's been a joy to contribute, even during the creation of this book.
Marian, let me direct this question to you, because I think you raised an issue that sort of nests with something that Dan said later, and that's Solzhenitsyn's reluctance to call things, at least in an explicit way, good or bad, although you can kind of see where he's passing judgment on characters and decisions. Today's conversation about history in Russia, particularly the revolution and other key moments, is very, I think it's fair to say, polarized. There's a lot of good and a lot of bad, being depicted. I wonder if you and maybe Dan as well could say something about the ways in which Solzhenitsyn's judgment of these historical events is used today or is thought about today in the conversation about history, other than just as a chronicler.
That's something I'll defer to Dan on that. I wouldn't know how that goes.
Dan,
I bet Dan does.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's really quite, and Stephan can completely correct me on this if there's some misemphasis in my remarks, but my impression is that For example, we recently had the anniversary of the centenary of the October Revolution. There was not a whole lot of celebrating of Lenin or Red October. In fact, there was the opening of the on the outskirts of Moscow of the great monument to the victims of communist repression. October 30th is now a Memorial Day for the victims of communism. So this all happens in Putin's Russia. It doesn't quite fit the narrative about a, sort of Soviet nostalgia. I think what's replaced the emphasis on the cult of Red October is the Great Patriotic War. And I would say there, Solzhenitsyn's really sympathy for those who raised arms against the Soviet state, even, certainly understanding what the Vlazovites did, seeing them in a way as tragic victims of, this sort of cauldron of two totalitarianisms. I think that's a part of Solzhenitsyn's view of the Soviet century that is not widely held or esteemed in Russia today. I think it's an untouchable subject, even among people who are largely anti-communist. I do think among most intellectuals, certainly Westernizing, people who see themselves as liberals, I think the cult of February 1917 persists. It's seen as the good, liberal, progressive, Western-oriented revolution. Solzhenitsyn has some views about Western liberals. By the way, Solzhenitsyn is not against liberalism understood a certain way, a liberalism that takes the responsibilities of government seriously. I think he makes a coherent and, to my mind, persuasive argument that somebody like Stolypin represented a conservative liberalism, the maintenance of state authority, significant reform, the gradual introduction and strengthening of a constitutional state, combined with a deep-seated patriotism, but not a fanatical nationalism. But that's not what most people mean by liberalism today. We have to understand, I mentioned Milyukov, the foreign minister of Russia. That's FedEx, we'll ignore it. Milyukov and the cadets refused to condemn terrorism right up to February 1917. Solzhenitsyn thought they were false liberals. A liberal party that refuses to condemn nihilistic terrorism for fear of what society would say, that distinctive Russian locution. So I think much of what Solzhenitsyn argues in this book, it's not extremist, it's not ultra-nationalist, he doesn't blame the Jews, all these fictions and legends. But I think he thinks that reform, progress, the development of constitutionalism within a system of stable order and law would best have occurred within the state, the existing state structures. And he does think, I think what March 17 represents was a disaster, simply a disaster. And to come back to Marian's point, he conveys so powerfully, so lucidly, how disastrous it was, how foolish the men of the provisional government were, without editorializing about it. Now, there is a companion work called Reflections on the February Revolution. It has 4 parts, and Solzhenitsyn initially intended these. They're wonderful, they're revealing, but they're more didactic essays. He was originally going to attach to all 4 volumes. And my understanding is Natalia Solzhenitsyn talked him out of it, saying that didactic emphasis would actually undermine the force and the literary character of the Red Wheel. And I think she was right. And he readily agreed. But that is a work that's not available in English. You can get it it's in Russian, it's in French. It's a book worth reading because it really expresses more directly some of these historiographical judgments that are implicit in March. And I'll make one point about the Tsar there. Marian said some very astute things about the treatments of both the Tsar and Tsarina. I would add that in the reflections of the February Revolution, Solzhenitsyn, his Tsar is not some authoritarian. He's weak. He's passive. He doesn't know how to exercise authority. He is, to the family. He's a good Christian, maybe too much of a Christian, and he puts too much concern on the fate and health and well-being of his family and not on the oath he has sworn to God of Russia. So I think that's all there in the narrative, in the drama, in the literary presentation in the Red Wheel, but some of those specific civic, historiographical, moral, political judgments become much more emphatic on the reflections on the February Revolution.
Thanks very much, Dan, for stepping up to that. Let me ask all three of you really kind of a cluster of questions, some of which have come from the audience and a couple of my own, regarding sources. And I'd love for all of you to weigh in with your various slices of understanding of this. So, one question from Robert Waters is, did Solzhenitsyn have any reminiscences to rely upon in his brilliant depiction of the emperor's thinking as he tried to decide whether to abdicate, or is it purely imaginative reconstruction? Stephan beautifully summed it up when he said that Nikolai was prepared to sacrifice himself for Russia, but did not know how. Why don't we just start with that one? Stephan, do you want to comment on that?
He had to do, we focus so much on the Tsar, on the emperor. Let me try to take that question a little more broadly. So Solzhenitsyn was born in December 1918. So he imbibed with his, he imbibed the fear. He didn't experience these events. He was born a year and a half after these events. He did live and experience the animal fear almost of, the early, of the early Soviet days when not only the February but the October Revolution had happened and had and had solidified its grip in a very brutal and a very I think in many ways an understudied decade, the 1920s. So it would be incorrect to say that it wouldn't be right to say either that he had any reminiscences, of what he's actually describing, but this was also a period when you could recall when the 20s were also a period when the revolution actually took a long time. In many ways, he later in one of his interviews spoke about, there wasn't actually a single one event, not even later, November 7th, 1917, the October Revolution, that was also just one event. That didn't change the country entirely and forever. January 1918, the final disbursement of the much revered and hallowed Constituent Assembly, which was supposed to be like the Constitutional Assembly of the United States, that completely failed. That didn't change Russia forever. But somewhere by 1931, you couldn't recognize the country. He did live through some of that period when you could, still eat the bread that I remember him recalling this. Because bread, the bread we could eat was nothing like the bread you could get in the Soviet Union. But wait a minute, the bread in the Soviet Union was nothing like what you could still have back then in his 20s childhood. So in a sense, I always have thought of him as a person who, even though he wasn't, quite there physically, absolutely came up in this period. As for sources, of course, he took advantage of absolutely every source he had. For example, Shulgin, he's one of the more interesting, somewhat conservative, but then pro-revolutionary, ultimately, Duma deputies, one of the classic, sort of with the cadets for this one. Shulgin is the person who actually, in the very beginning of this volume, reads the manifesto. just look at the biography of of this guy later. He's emigrated. He's out. He's in Paris, but then after the war, he's taken by the Red Army. Now he's in prison back in the Soviet Union after World War II. He's let out, an old man. He's in his 80s. He attends a Communist Party, 1962, Khrushchev. He's attending a Communist Party convention. In effect, this is a monarchist. He's mainly known as a monarchist, even though he took part in this abdication. He's known as a monarchist, and he's dying. He's living out his last days in the 1960s in basically an old folks home in the city of Vladimir. Right? Solzhenitsyn, of course, goes and finds him. He wasn't going to let a source like that go unused. And of course that, and yes, he had read his books in the 1920s, but of course he takes advantage. When he gets access to Hoover Institution, library in where incredible troves of sources happen, yeah, this really lights up. This book could not have been written without a whole combination, a lifetime lived where he lived it, but also a whole world that opened up to him of direct sources in already available in the West. So I think it's both. I really think it's both, but not in a direct physical sense. He didn't live through this period.
If I can, Dan, I see you can go ahead and unmute as well. But if I can append a question about Soviet sources. I mean, obviously the Soviet system had developed a whole, industry of archiving these heady days of the early revolution and so forth. I can imagine on a certain level what his attitude towards such sources would have been, but at the same time, would he have found, did he find such things of any value? Did he have any access to them? What was sort of, as a historian, his juggling between the different categories of sources and their origin?
As a very brief answer, February was completely just ignored. In other words, you couldn't find much about February except for, which as Dan had said it, sort of. And then after, it's a comma. It's a and then after abdication and an unsuccessful and bourgeois attempt to try to run the country, happened the big revolution. So he set out actually to write about the October Revolution, but then I'm repeating what Dan said earlier. So I yield the floor.
Dan, it looked like
I would just add, my phone fell through the cracks, so I had to restore it. I think that's absolutely right, that Soviet historiography wasn't, that the treatment of February was hackneyed and ideological and not terribly interesting. I know Solzhenitsyn thought the treatment of figures like Stolypin and Kolchak was worthless, that it was the things that were said about Stolypin, for example, the gap between the Soviet propaganda and slander and the real statesman was overwhelming. Solzhenitsyn always claimed that this cycle of books aimed at absolute historical verisimilitude. And so, as Stephan already mentioned, the immense amount of work that Solzhenitsyn did at the Hoover Institution. And I think that's absolutely right. Without that work, the newspapers, all the other resources from 17, from the Civil War, from the Revolutionary period. Also, Solzhenitsyn read in the Journal of the Red Wheel. He talks a lot about memoirs from emigres that he read, and he commissioned a lot of them. He set up. Did I get the title right? The Russian Memoir Library, Stephan?
Yes.
Yes.
All Russian Memoir Library.
Yeah, I mean, there was a P.O. box in Boston, and Solzhenitsyn said this was an older, even dying generation, and Solzhenitsyn said, send me your stories, send me your diaries, send me your accounts of this period. Not all of them were of great literary value, but I think almost all of them were of tremendous value for capturing the atmosphere, understanding what had happened in a way that cleared the air through the ideological, the hackneyed cliches and all that had dominated the historiography of the Revolution and Civil War. So there was a conference on the Red Wheel at the Solzhenitsyn Center in Moscow in December of 2011 that I had the privilege to attend. And Natalia Solzhenitsyn gave a beautiful presentation about the archive. And she talked about how everything was laid out and divided, and the number of sources Solzhenitsyn drew on: books, newspapers, historical studies, how carefully this was put together. It was a really, I don't remember all of the details, but it was a really fascinating presentation. And among other things, it really, not only was Solzhenitsyn, as Stephan said so well, so organized and prepared and thinking ahead of time, and as the Journal of the Red Wheel points out, coming back to these themes, and even recording his dreams. We had conversations with the Tsar in his dreams, and he records all of this in the journal. But I also think, as his editor, Natalia Solzhenitsyn was really a major part of the whole enterprise, not only correcting and editing and giving advice and suggesting, but you might say the whole organizational enterprise, the thought, the historiography, the writings, the memoirs that provided fuel for Solzhenitsyn's reflections and ruminations. So it's quite, my guess, Stephan could answer much better than me. My guess is that Solzhenitsyn probably did not draw a lot on on Soviet historiography from that period. He knew of it, he looked at some of it, but my impression is he did not find it extremely helpful.
Marian, would you please come in on this, please?
Okay. I think this whole issue of sources can be looked at, and the importance it is in the publication history of this book is something that I've encountered with other Russian books, which is it's difficult to get a publisher to take a book like this because it doesn't actually fit our understanding of how history is written. I've been involved in other books which have had the exact same issue, where the books themselves are demonstrably sourced and not actually implicitly sourced, but not explicitly sourced. And in the case of histories that involve dialogue, or to say nothing of Red Wheel, where there's fictional characters, is it a history book? What do these publishers do with it? It's not written in our genre, and it's prevented. Well, one book I did finally found a publisher who was willing to accept it on that grounds, but the book, I've got another book now that is totally researched, but it reads, it's history. It is in fact history, as is the Red Wheel, but there's nowhere for us to pigeonhole it. And I think that has been a problem for, not just for Solzhenitsyn, but it's a problem for Russian historical writing in general. Not in general, but a great deal. There's been a great deal of it that may be more engaging, maybe more effective, but without footnotes and bibliographies and those explicit proofs of fact, they invite suspicion and make it really rough on publishers.
But if I could add just one thing to that, I think the great thing here is that we've got decades. We don't all have to be. We don't all have to live to see it. But this whole topic is waiting for its historical. I don't know, the graduate student or the person who wants to actually go and build, and actually eventually, as we're making very slowly, it's a very painstaking process to just make the archive, the Solzhenitsyn archive, available, to make this archive that Dan described as it exists, but actually to make it available for research, to see all these different scripts, to see the microfilms of the papers that he was looking at as he was copying it out, and actually potentially could be a great a service to the academic world to actually, see the source, the sources are all there. I remember I went back, I had to in some work, not on this, but other Solzhenitsyn passages. I realized he could not have possibly made this up. This is all true, but I needed to footnote it. So, off I traipsed to, beautiful Stanford, California, look at a couple of palm trees, run up to the tower, and boom, I just said, okay, it's got to be here, 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 here. In about 2 hours, I found the 10 places he had been looking at in 1976 when he was there, except now they were all with footnotes, right? So, somebody could do this for a couple of years, and we would then, eventually have the footnotes. And of course, you wouldn't ever want to put that next to a historical novel, because this is, dramatized history. You don't want to mix dramatized history and not dramatized history. But it is in fact history in the sense of, I think you can even feel where he's, where he's doing, imagining the sort of a personality. You can almost see that that's the dramatization part. Everything else is either history or the 5 or 6 fictional, in reality more, maybe 10 or 12 small characters who are usually drawn on relatives of his or people he knew, who he's imagining, their life. Some of it not imagining, but some of it is their true history of their family members. So he shows how the revolution affects not just historical people, but those others. You wouldn't want to mix those two things, but I think it would make fantastic research for somebody later to actually go and mix match. And then I think a lot of people could, use that to, to come to their own conclusions, impressions. I think there's much to be, there's much to look forward to, I think, in the crossing of the literature and the pure academic history that are indeed in some tension here.
Yeah, I certainly wasn't casting aspersions on the sources or the accuracy of them. And I don't think that necessarily publishers would too, particularly with someone like Solzhenitsyn and of his stature. But it's just the genre. Yeah. We have historical novels and we have history, and they're different, and they have different markets, and they have different series, and they don't. Publishers need help. They need a lot of help. And if you're not going to play their game, you must have, you've got the Solzhenitsyn name, and that's how you do it, because he's got his stature and his history and his Nobel Prize and things like that. But it's a technical problem that is not peculiar to him. It's just that he's done better around it than most because of who he is.
I find that Marian has translated Yusufovich, right? Yusufovich has, I would say, is very much, we get has the same topic that he very interesting, very powerful, and you're reading both history and drama. Mm-hmm. My sense is, I understood, Marian, that you're saying exactly in that spirit. I would tend to say that it's just of two things, right? One is there's fodder for the academic to grow out of it, but more than anything, I agree with you. Publishers need help, but actually, more than anything, I would say, if works like this can help start blurring lines and blurring pigeonholes, kind of breaking down walls a little bit, how fantastic that would be. Who said, right, that something has to be in one of a few genres? Really, Notre Dame should be thanked, for the Notre Dame Press should be thanked for saying, yeah, indeed, we'll take it as it is, and that's created this wonderful opportunity for us.
So
it's the sales department that says this.
We have just 2 minutes remaining, and I want to ask one final question for all of you to weigh in on, fairly briefly if you can, which is, of course, the work is now available for the first time in English, but has been available in the original Russian. What about the salience of this for Russian readers today? Not necessarily of this English translation, but of the work itself, as we're exactly a century away from the events or from the end of the chronicle, essentially. Is this something that you expect to impact Russian readers in a different, more significant way relative to, I have to ask the contemporary question, right? Relative to what's happening in Russia today and the way that the revolution is debated.
Solzhenitsyn, in the latter part of book 2 of Between Two Millstones, his autobiographical account of his years in the West, the late 80s, after the Gorbachev phenomena, Solzhenitsyn was very anxious to get the Red Wheel available in the Soviet Union in its dying days, and then in post-communist Russia, because he thought there were lessons there. He thought the lessons of February 17 were very pertinent to the whole debate about how precipitous, how radical, how immediate the movement away from the old order to the new ought to be, shock reform and all that. And he worried that Russia would make some of the same mistakes in the 90s that she had made in 1917. He worried, for example, that Russia would leave Bolshevism in a Bolshevik manner, top down, all sorts of mistakes. So he was partly right about that. He talked about the third time of troubles. Russia came out of Bolshevism, which Solzhenitsyn despised, in the worst possible way. And of course, the broad public support, it may not be as great as we're sometimes led to believe, but the broad amount of support for the sort of managed authoritarianism, semi-authoritarianism of the Putin regime has something to do with the calamitous character of the 90s. So independent of what historiographers and historians are saying, I think Solzhenitsyn thought the Red Wheel had an awful lot to say about the way why Russia ought to avoid a revolutionary spirit, even in the way it departed from communism. And there's more, but I think he also had other projects. He says in the Journal of the Red Wheel, for me, Stolypin is not a figure of the past. He's very much a figure of the future. He wanted to bring that conservative liberal wisdom to Russia, And of course, unfortunately, in the polemical and journalistic treatments of Solzhenitsyn, Pipes compared him to Pobedonostov, and he was, associated with the extreme right wing, but that wasn't his own self-understanding. His own self-understanding was he wanted to bring some of the knowledge that he had arrived at through the Red Wheel to renew, you might say, a tradition of ordered liberty in Russia. And those are at least very important themes, self-conscious themes that are articulated in the final sections of Between Two Millstones.
Thanks so much, Dan. Stephan, Marian, final word from each of you? No? Nothing from Marian? Stephan?
I think that on the question you had asked, it'll come to be, there's this wonderful line about Russia. It's a country with an unpredictable past. We'll every, I guarantee you that if we could fast forward exactly 20 years from today, and 40 and 60 and 80 and 100 years from today, I can guarantee you that those would be and somebody in your shoes, Matt, and somebody in my shoes asks that question. These will be, unpredictably interesting and different answers that get given about what the relevance is. Let's just hope that many people read the books. Actually, to me, that ultimately the impact of a book is all about the reader. So
I couldn't agree more. And of course, the impact is only possible thanks to you. Thank you so much, Stephan. Thank you, Marian, for your effort on this. Dan, for your brilliant commentary. The book, again, and here I'm hiding the fact that it's my pre-production copy, but it's March 1917 of the Red Wheel, volume 3. And it is, one thing is predictable, it's available. You can get it from the University of Notre Dame Press. You can rewatch this episode for a code that will get you a discount. And please tune in to everything that we're up to at the Kennan Institute via our website, where you can listen to our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File, as well as take a look at our blogs on Russia and Ukraine. And we will soon be bringing you the interactive map that accompanies this series. So stay tuned for that. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you all for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Matthew.